a residential driveway at 2013 in the morning, an unconscious man on the pavement, and a paramedic kneeling over him with both hands occupied, one checking a pulse, the other reaching for a defibrillator pad. A patrol car pulls up behind the ambulance. Within 90 seconds, that same paramedic would be staring down the barrel of a service weapon, hands raised, the patient he'd been saving left momentarily without care. 24 hours later, the officer who drew that weapon would no longer have a job. This is how it happened. Trevor Banks had been a paramedic for 9 years, the last 4 with the city's busiest overnight unit. The kind of rotation most of his colleagues avoided because it meant cardiac arrests, overdoses, and car wrecks instead of the steadier daytime calls everyone preferred. He liked the night shift precisely because of that intensity. He'd grown up watching his older brother struggle with addiction, watching emergency responders arrive too late more times than he wanted to remember, and he'd built his entire career around the simple, stubborn belief that a few minutes of faster, calmer response could be the difference between a funeral and a recovery. His brother had gotten clean eventually, largely because a paramedic on a different overnight call years earlier had taken an extra few minutes to talk him through a crisis rather than simply transport him, and Trevor had never forgotten the quiet, specific debt he felt toward that kind of patience. He was good at his job in the specific, unglamorous way that mattered most. Steady hands during chaos, clear communication with panicked families, the ability to make split-second clinical decisions without ever losing the calm, reassuring tone that kept patients from spiraling into deeper panic. His supervisor had nominated him twice for the department's Regional Excellence Award, both times for calls where Trevor had stabilized patients well outside the margins. Anyone expected to be survivable, and younger paramedics in the unit often requested to shadow him specifically, hoping to absorb some of the composure that seemed to come so naturally to him under pressure that most people would have been paralyzing. The 911 call came in just after 2 in the morning. A 61-year-old man collapsed in his driveway, conscious when his wife found him but fading fast. Possible cardiac event. Trevor and his partner, a younger paramedic named Sophia Reyes, arrived within 6 minutes, finding the man unresponsive on the concrete, his wife kneeling beside him in her bathrobe, screaming his name into the dark, her voice carrying the particular raw terror of someone watching a decades-long marriage hang in the balance in real time. Trevor moved immediately into the practiced rhythm of his training, checking airway, checking pulse, calling for the defibrillator pads, while Sophia prepped the monitor, both of them working with the focused, wordless efficiency of partners who'd run hundreds of calls together. They'd developed, over their years working together, an almost telepathic shorthand, each anticipating the other's next move without needing to articulate it, a rhythm built entirely from repetition and trust, earned across countless similarly chaotic scenes. Neither of them registered the patrol car pulling up at the curb behind their ambulance, lights off, responding to an unrelated, unconfirmed report of a disturbance 2 houses down that dispatch had mistakenly routed to the same address. Officer Wade Pruitt had been with the department for 11 years and carried a long, well-documented history of escalating routine encounters faster than his colleagues considered necessary, a pattern that had generated 4 prior internal complaints, none of which had resulted in any meaningful disciplinary action. Colleagues who had worked alongside him over the years described him privately as someone who treated every call as a potential threat, regardless of how routine it appeared, a tendency some attributed to a difficult incident early in his career that he rarely discussed, but that several longtime officers believed had never been properly addressed through any formal counseling or review. He arrived at the scene expecting a domestic disturbance, found instead a chaotic tableau of flashing ambulance lights, a screaming woman, and a man crouched over a body in the dark. Details his mind assembled, in the space of a few panicked seconds, into something far more violent than what was actually happening. He didn't announce himself. He drew his weapon the moment he stepped out of his cruiser, training it on Trevor's back as he approached at a fast, tense walk, his voice cutting through the dark with no preamble at all. "Get on the ground. Hands where I can see them. Now." Trevor froze mid-compression, his hands still resting on the unconscious man's chest, the defibrillator pads half attached. I'm a paramedic. I have a patient in cardiac arrest. I need you to lower that weapon. He kept his voice deliberately even, drawing on every hour of crisis communication training he'd ever absorbed, recognizing instinctively that panic on his own part would only accelerate whatever was already unfolding in front of him. I said, "Get down." Pruitt's voice cracked with adrenaline, his weapon still trained directly on Trevor's center mass, close enough now that Sophia, frozen a few feet away with the monitor still in her hands, could see his finger resting against the trigger guard rather than alongside the frame the way training required. "Officer, look at my uniform. I'm actively treating a cardiac patient. If I stop right now, this man could die." Trevor's voice carried none of the panic flooding through his chest, years of training holding his tone level even as every instinct screamed at him to move. On the ground, last warning. The wife, still kneeling beside her husband, began screaming louder now, a different kind of terror entering her voice as she registered the gun pointed at the man trying to save her husband's life. "He's a paramedic. He's helping my husband. Please, please don't." Her voice cranked entirely on the last word, the sound carrying across the quiet street with a rawness that would later be the single most repeated moment in every version of the footage that circulated online. Sophia, hands raised and trembling, attempted to intervene. "Officer, this is an active medical call, please. You're going to get this patient killed." She'd been a paramedic for only 3 years, considerably less experienced than Trevor, and the part of her mind not consumed by sheer terror was registering, with a kind of detached clinical horror, exactly how close they were to losing the patient entirely, regardless of how this standoff ended. Pruitt's eyes flicked toward her for half a second before snapping back to Trevor, his weapon never wavering, his breathing audibly ragged now. "Both of you, hands up, slowly." "I cannot raise my hands. My patient's heart has stopped," Trevor said, the words coming faster now, the clinical part of his brain running parallel calculations about how many seconds had already passed without compressions, how quickly that translated into permanent damage if this standoff continued. "I'm begging you to lower your weapon and let me do my job." For nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in the math of cardiac arrest, nobody moved. Trevor's hands hovered just above the unconscious man's chest, neither fully raised nor continuing compressions, caught in an impossible calculation between his own survival and his patient's. Every additional second without circulation meant measurable, compounding damage to the man's brain, a fact Trevor understood with painful clarity even as he remained frozen, his entire training screaming at him to resume compressions while every instinct for self-preservation screamed the opposite. It was the Watts' husband's neighbor, awakened by the screaming and stepping onto his own porch with his phone already recording, who finally broke the standoff by shouting across the yard, "That's an ambulance, that's medical. What are you doing?" The neighbor's shout seemed cut through whatever adrenaline-fogged certainty had gripped Pruitt, his weapon lowering by a few critical inches as his eyes finally registered, fully, the ambulance parked at the curb, its lights still flashing, the patches on Trevor and Sophia's uniforms now visible in a way they apparently hadn't been moments earlier. "Go," Pruitt said, his voice suddenly unsteady, weapon dropping further. "Go, do whatever you need to do." Trevor didn't wait for further permission. He resumed compressions immediately, calling out vitals to Sophia in the clipped, efficient shorthand of partners who'd done this together countless times, both of them working now with the particular intensity that came from knowing every lost second mattered more than it had 30 seconds earlier, their hands moving in the same practiced rhythm that nearly 40 minutes of physical training every month was designed to make second nature, even after a standoff that had tested every ounce of that conditioning. They got a pulse back within 4 minutes, loaded the patient into the ambulance, and were gone within 6, leaving Pruitt standing alone in the driveway, weapon now holstered, the neighbor's phone still recording from the porch across the street. The patient survived, stabilized at the hospital within the hour, his cardiac event treated successfully despite the delay, though the attending cardiologist later noted privately that the extended gap in compressions had introduced a level of risk that, under slightly different circumstances, could easily have changed the outcome entirely. But the neighbor's video, 11 minutes of raw, unedited footage capturing the entire standoff from the moment Pruitt drew his weapon to the moment the ambulance finally pulled away, had already been uploaded by sunrise, the wife's screaming pleas and Trevor's calm, desperate explanations audible throughout the entire recording. By 7 that morning, the fire department's EMS division, which oversaw the city's paramedic contract, had received the video through 3 separate channels simultaneously. A dispatcher who recognized Trevor's voice, the hospital's own incident reporting system, and a direct forward from the patient's furious wife, who had tracked down the department's general number before the sun had fully risen, refusing to hang up until someone in a position of authority personally confirmed they had watched the footage themselves. The EMS division chief, a retired Army medic named Colonel Renata Voss, watched the video once in her office, then called the police chief directly, her voice carrying a controlled fury that colleagues described as unlike anything they'd heard from her before. "I have 11 minutes of footage showing one of your officers holding a loaded weapon on my paramedic while he was performing CPR on a cardiac arrest patient," Voss told the police chief directly. "I want to know right now whether this department considers that an acceptable risk to take with a patient's life, because I am about to make a very public decision about whether my paramedics can safely respond to calls in this city at all." Voss had spent 18 years as an Army medic before transitioning to civilian emergency services, and colleagues who knew her well said she rarely raised her voice precisely because she didn't need to. The controlled, deliberate weight she carried into difficult conversations usually accomplished more than volume ever could. The police chief, watching the same footage within the hour, didn't need extensive deliberation to recognize the severity of what had happened. Pruitt's prior disciplinary history, combined with the unambiguous footage and the patient's documented medical risk during the delay, left almost no room for the kind of measured, weeks-long review process the department typically applied to use-of-force complaints. The chief later told reporters that watching the footage, alongside the documented timeline of the patient's resuscitation, had made the decision considerably easier than it otherwise might have been. There was simply no version of events in which drawing a weapon on a paramedic mid-CPR could be characterized as reasonable, regardless of the dispatch error that had placed Pruitt at the scene in the first place. By that afternoon, the police department had placed Pruitt on immediate unpaid administrative leave pending termination, an unusually swift response that the chief later acknowledged in a public statement was directly shaped by both the video's clarity and the documented medical risk the standoff had created for an actively dying patient. The statement, released within 24 hours of the incident, represented one of the fastest disciplinary actions the department had taken in recent memory, a pace several local officials and reporters noted as a clear departure from the department's usual, considerably slower review timeline. The internal affairs review that followed, though compressed into an unusually tight timeframe given the urgency of the situation, was thorough. Investigators confirmed that dispatch had, in fact, sent Pruitt to the wrong address entirely, a clerical error that had routed an unrelated disturbance call to the same block as the cardiac arrest, a mistake that, while explaining Pruitt's initial confusion, did nothing to excuse his decision to draw a weapon on clearly identified medical personnel without first attempting verbal de-escalation or basic situational assessment. The dispatch error itself, investigators noted separately, would also need its own corrective review, though everyone involved agreed it explained, at most, the initial confusion, nothing about the subsequent 30 seconds of escalation. The neighbor's footage, combined with Trevor and Sophia's body-worn cameras, standard equipment for the EMS division that most residents didn't realize paramedics carried, provided multiple synchronized angles of the entire standoff, eliminating any ambiguity about the sequence of events or the explicit, repeated identification both paramedics had offered before Pruitt's weapon was ever lowered. Reviewing the footage frame by frame, investigators noted that Trevor had identified himself as a paramedic within the first 4 seconds of Pruitt's arrival, well before the officer's weapon had even fully cleared its holster. Pruitt's personnel file, pulled as part of the standard review process, revealed 4 prior internal complaints spanning nearly 6 years, each involving allegations of unnecessarily aggressive escalation during routine encounters. None had resulted in suspension or termination, a pattern the investigating officer's final report specifically flagged as a broader institutional failure that had allowed warning signs to accumulate without meaningful consequence until they finally collided with a situation severe enough to force action. In his interview, Pruitt attempted to argue that the chaotic scene combined with the wrong address dispatch error, had created genuine uncertainty about whether a crime was in progress. The lead investigator, presented with Pruitt's 4 prior complaints alongside the current footage, was direct in her assessment. You had 2 uniformed paramedics, a marked ambulance with active lights, and a screaming woman identifying the situation as medical within the first 5 seconds of your arrival. This wasn't ambiguous. You chose to escalate to a drawn weapon in a situation that called for nothing more than a moment of basic observation. And your file shows this wasn't the first time observation lost out to instinct. Pruitt had no meaningful rebuttal to the pattern laid out in front of him, and the investigator's written conclusion noted explicitly that the cumulative weight of his prior history made any argument toward an isolated lapse in judgment considerably harder to sustain. Pruitt was formally terminated within 24 hours of the incident, the department's swift action driven by the combination of clear video evidence, the documented medical risk to the patient, and his existing pattern of prior complaints that had never previously resulted in meaningful consequences. The state's Police Standards Board opened its own parallel review almost immediately, ultimately revoking his certification given the severity of drawing a weapon on identified medical personnel during an active life-saving intervention. A decision the board's written ruling described as an unambiguous and severe departure from acceptable use of force standards. The fire department's EMS division, in the days following the incident, negotiated a new protocol directly with city police leadership requiring mandatory dispatch verification before any officer responded to a scene already occupied by an active ambulance call, specifically designed to prevent the kind of address mix-up that had placed Pruitt at the wrong scene in the first place. The protocol additionally mandated de-escalation training specifically addressing how to safely approach scenes involving uniformed medical personnel, a gap in standard police training that the incident had exposed with uncomfortable clarity, and one that several other cities' emergency services divisions reportedly began reviewing within their own departments after the story spread beyond local coverage. Trevor didn't pursue a personal lawsuit, choosing instead to focus his energy on the protocol changes he believed mattered more than any individual settlement. He testified before the City Council's Public Safety Committee 3 weeks after the incident, describing in calm clinical detail exactly what those frozen 30 seconds had felt like. The parallel calculation running through his mind between his own survival and his patient's, a calculation no first responder should ever have to make while doing the job they'd been trained and trusted to do. Committee members later said his composed, almost clinical delivery of the testimony had a far greater impact on the room than an emotional account might have, precisely because it mirrored the same steady professionalism that had defined his entire response that night. "I think about that man's wife's voice more than I think about the gun," Trevor told the committee. "She was screaming because she thought she was about to watch 2 people she needed die in front of her at the same time. That's not a risk anyone should have to carry into a driveway at 2 in the morning." The committee chair, visibly moved, asked Trevor directly what single change he believed would have prevented the standoff entirely. Trevor didn't hesitate. A radio call confirming the address before anyone drew a weapon. That's it. That's the whole gap. The patient, once stable enough to learn what had happened during his own resuscitation, personally requested to meet Trevor at a follow-up appointment months later, thanking him not just for the medical care but for the particular composure Trevor had maintained under circumstances the patient still found difficult to fully process even after hearing the full account. The 2 men talked for nearly an hour that afternoon, the patient repeatedly returning to the same disbelieving question, how Trevor had managed to keep treating him at all in the middle of something so dangerous, and Trevor, characteristically, deflecting most of the credit back towards Sophia and the training that had simply taken over once his hands found the familiar rhythm of compressions. Trevor returned to the same overnight rotation the following week, continuing the work he'd built his entire career around, though colleagues noted developed a quiet new habit of glancing toward the street more often during outdoor calls, a small, lingering adjustment from a night that had nearly cost far more than anyone arriving at that driveway could have anticipated. Sophia, for her part, became something of an informal advocate within the department for expanded body camera requirements across all overnight EMS units, citing the footage from that night as the single piece of evidence that had made the difference between a contested he-said-she-said dispute and an unambiguous 24-hour resolution. This story is a reminder that even the clearest signs of someone doing exactly the job they're trained for can be overridden by a moment of unchecked assumption, and that the margin between a life saved and a tragedy compounded sometimes comes down to nothing more than 30 seconds of someone choosing not to look closely enough before acting. For everyone who was in that driveway that night, the math of those 30 seconds never quite stopped running in the background, a quiet reminder of how thin the line had truly been between a story with a survivor at its center and one without. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more true stories of justice finally catching up.